Hi, it's Professor Alan McConnell, and I'm here today to spend a few minutes to talk to you about APA style so you know what it's all about and why we have it. So what is APA style? APA style is the American Psychological Association's established official guide for standardizing how research papers are to be written, and this standardization exists to help facilitate scientific communication. APA style ensures that there's a consistency or an orthodoxy of paper organization to ensure that pertinent details are present and unnecessary details are not present in papers that are submitted for scientific review. This style makes sure that past work is cited appropriately, and it helps multiple audiences, whether that's authors or reviewers, the people who look at the research that's submitted and make judgments about whether it's publishable, editors, the people who look at all the reviews and make the editorial decision about whether to accept a paper, publishers, the people who actually publish the scientific studies in large volumes in the journals, and all the other relevant audiences to make sure they've got all the information they need for their various processes. And right now, at this current moment, APA style is transitioning from 6th edition style, which was published back in 2010, to 7th edition style, which was just published last year in 2019. So this is one of the reasons why we're not going to focus so much on specifics of APA style here in Psych 112. You're going to get a lot of that when you get to Psychology 293, and you'll have to learn APA style in much greater detail. But today what I want to do is just give you an overview of APA style and why we have it. So how can you find out about APA style? There's a few resources that you can turn to. One, as you saw in the video that you probably saw earlier, maybe even today, is that the Miami Libraries has a site that gives you all sorts of great resources about APA style. They've updated this recently. It's really quite good, and I think you'll find it to be an excellent resource for you. So Miami's Libraries has this really great resource. In addition, a second great resource is at Purdue University, and it's called the Purdue OWL. And OWL stands for Online Writing Lab. So rather than give you the URL for the Purdue site, I would just encourage you to Google OWL APA style into any search engine, and it will pop this up. The APA OWL site at Purdue is one of the most widely used sites that has great sample papers and things like that. So if after looking at the Miami site, if you have any questions, I'm sure you'll be able to get the answers you want from the OWL site as well. And then the third place you can go is the American Psychological Association's website as well. Now you might wonder why I would put the APA website as the third option rather than the first option. And it's basically pretty straightforward. Leo, drop it. Sorry, my dog just pilfered a piece of our garden. Why would I put the APA style, APA website rather, third? That's because the APA website, I think, is one of the least authoritative websites. And actually, it's kind of a hustle where the APA tries to, they'll give you some details, but then they try to really push their books and try to encourage you to buy their style guide. So although there's nothing wrong with the website per se, I don't like recommending it because I really feel like APA is pushing their own books a little too heavily. So given all that, what are the other sort of features that we get out of an APA style organization of a paper? Well, one thing to think about is that every paper that gets published in a scientific journal starts as a manuscript. In other words, the document that the authors who are conducting the research, doing the statistical analyses, and writing it all up, the manuscript is what they submit to the journal for consideration. And that is a really long manuscript. So right now I'm going to show you an example of a paper that we published a few years ago on the health and well-being benefits of pet ownership, which is kind of ironic given that my dog right now is in the background. This paper, when we typed it, was 51 pages long. So if you look here on the left, you see the manuscript. That's 51 typed pages. Everything is double spaced in that paper, as you can see, and it's really lengthy. So if you look at the top left, you'll see the title page, which is the front page, and then the second page, which is the abstract, and then you kind of see a whole series of pages. Toward the end, you can see some tables, and then the very last page of the manuscript has a figure that appeared in the paper. So that 51-page paper is what we submitted to the journal for consideration to see whether or not it was publishable in the journal, which in this case was the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. The paper was eventually accepted. It took us 18 months to get the paper accepted. They wanted us to conduct additional studies, do additional analyses to rule out some competing hypotheses, but ultimately the paper was published. And that paper, when it was published in typeset form, is only 14 pages in length. So rather than being double-spaced with 12-point font, the typeset version is single-spaced with 10-point font. And as you can see on the right side here, the tables and figures that are on separate pages in the manuscript that was submitted are now all integrated and typeset into the layout. So when you go online or when you go to the library and you pull out a journal article, what you're going to see in those journals is the typeset version that you see here on the right, but that all started with the manuscript version that you see here on the left. So again, when you're writing a paper, it's going to look like what you see on the left side. If it ultimately gets published, it'll look like what you see on the right. So the APA style helps to organize how the paper is structured, and this is really important. So all papers in APA style that are manuscripts follow a set sort of structure in terms of what comes in what order. The very first page is called the title page, and this is where people see the paper's title, the authors who help write the paper, and the institutions that they're associated with. The second page of every manuscript is always the abstract, and the abstract is what basically summarizes the whole paper. It's a single paragraph that's no more than 250 words that basically describes the whole paper in a nutshell. So there could be several experiments in a paper, but you have to summarize them all in 250 words, and that's a pretty challenging paragraph to write. Then on the third page of every manuscript is the start of the introduction. This is where the actual part of the paper begins. So you start off with a really broad sort of overview of the literature. You narrow it down to the questions that have not been answered, and then that eventually takes you down to the hypotheses for your study. So it's got the background, it's got the rationale, and it's got your hypotheses. After the introduction, there may be one experiment, or there may be several experiments, but they're just basically presented. Study 1, Study 2, Study 3, Study 4. And within each of those experiments, you will find 3 sections that exist in every experiment. One is a method section, which describes what took place, who the participants were, the measures that were used, and the procedure that was followed. The second section of every study is called the results section. This is where the data are presented. So the statistical analyses are presented there, all the statistical tests. If there are any tables or figures, they're described here in the results section. And then at the very end of each study, there's a section called the discussion section. And the discussion section is where you summarize the results section, but you do it in English rather than in statistics-ese. So this is basically taking all those statistics, boiling it down to English, and this helps someone who maybe doesn't have as much statistical sophistication understand what the findings were of that study. After you describe all the experiments, the next section is the general discussion. And this is a summary of the findings of the paper. It tells us kind of, some of the implications of the work, and also lays out the limitations. No study is perfect, and there's always a few limitations or a few unanswered questions, and this is where the authors acknowledge those limitations. After that, there's the section called the references, and this is where all the cited work is presented. So we'll talk a little bit about this in a second, but basically every time you cite an author in a paper, you eventually have to put their paper in the reference section with details so a reader can find that paper. And then finally, if there's any additional materials, they come at the very end of the document. So if you have appendices to give people kind of a more substantial description of your materials, or you're presenting tables or figures, all that is presented in the last section of the paper. Last thing I want to talk about today in our video is what is up with the references. Why are references such a big deal? Well, references are really important in a scientific paper because all scholarship that's conducted in science is based on other people's prior work. So you're basing it on other people's findings. You're borrowing their theories. You might have realized that they had some limits to what they did, and your study is addressing those limits. There's unanswered questions that always exist in literatures. So what you do is you provide documentation of this past work to give those people credit for their ideas, and that documentation builds the foundation for the current work. In addition to providing the rationale and the context for your work, the other reason why you cite the literature is that ultimately you hope your findings contribute something back to the literature. So by making those connections with the existing literature, you're also going to try to give back to the literature with the findings that you conducted. So we cite past work so we can give credit to other people for their ideas, and this is how we avoid plagiarism in science. It's also important sometimes to cite other people's work because maybe you disagree with one of their conclusions. Maybe a paper that you're referencing thought that this was their conclusion, but your interpretation is different. You need to explain their interpretation, why you think it's different, and then move on to your work in your paper. So when it comes to citing work, there's kind of two important elements of this. First off, as you're writing your paper, in the prose of the main body of your paper, you cite their work. So here I give you an example of a paper. If you say something like, as McConnell and Jacobs 2020 found, yada, 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 that is called a citation. By noting that the authors, in this case, McConnell and Jacobs, you provide the year of their paper, you basically are describing this is what these other authors found. So that's what we call citations. You cite the work in the body of the paper. And then at the very end of the paper, like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, there's this reference section. And the reference section is there at the end of the manuscript to provide details for how you can find that past work. Not only just the authors and the year that the paper was published, but what was their paper called? In what journal was it located? What volume number or which sort of edition of the journal can you find it? And what were the page numbers involved? So these are where we have all these precise rules for citing and referencing. And APA style is really a stickler on these points, but we use APA style so that there's consistency. So everyone knows that at the end of the paper, they'll find the references, they'll have all the details they need to find that paper if they want to look it up themselves, and you're giving everyone else credit for their past work. So anyway, that's just a brief overview of APA style. Again, in our class here in Psych 111, I'm not going to ask you to memorize it. You will have to do that stuff later in Psych 293, but I wanted to give you an overview of APA style so you have a sense of why we use it and what it's helping us accomplish in science. So thanks a lot. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.